Hi, welcome to part 4 of Building and Researching Your Family Tree series. My name is Hannah and I'm a librarian at the Waco Genealogy Center, and today I'll be joined by Bill Buckner, who is the supervisor of the Waco Genealogy Center, part of the Waco McLennan County Library. So what are vital records? These are records that refer to the critical events in a person's life. That includes birth, marriage, and death records. Also, if there's an adoption or divorce, those records would be considered vital records as well. So what's the value of these records? Well, they're a good source of primary information about a person's life. So that includes things like maiden name, birth, death, and marriage dates, the location of the cemetery or funeral home, and it also includes the names of people who participated in these events, such as any witnesses, ministers, physicians, or any other participants in the event. There's two different levels where these records are kept: church and government records. So typically what we see in the United States is these records are kept by local governments, typically the county. And they record these events at the time that the event happened and maintain those records in their archives. They also typically send a copy of the record to the state government. Prior to this system, many countries used churches to maintain and collect vital records. So in England, for example, civil registration didn't begin until 1837. Anything earlier than that is going to be maintained by the church. In general terms, laws regulating access to vital records varies by state. So in Texas, for example, birth certificates are protected for 75 years, and death certificates are protected for 25 years. That means the public does not have access to the information on those documents for that amount of time. This length varies by state. If you would like to access a record prior to that window of opportunity, then you have to prove that you meet certain identity requirements, such as being next of kin, to access that record. Typically, these records are going to be stored with the health department of a certain county, and then the county sends the records to the state. As you're doing research with vital records, it's important to work backwards through time. So starting with death records, moving to marriage, and then to birth. Clues on one document often leads you to help find information on another. And we'll look at some examples of this as we go through today. As you look at these records, it's important to think about where did this information come from, who was the source of the information, and whether it is a primary or secondary source of that information. So let's review some examples. Some things to notice as we go through is how the information collected varies through time and by location. Every state records information a little bit differently, and the forms changed over time. Some records are going to be more complete than others, and the legibility of those records is going to vary greatly, which can lead to transcription errors, which is an important thing to keep in mind as you're searching for your ancestors' documents. So starting off, we have a 1975 Texas death certificate. And the first thing that jumps out is the fact that in the margin on this document, the spouse's name is written in. So there's not a blank on the form to record information about the spouse, but whoever filled out this document felt like that was an important bit of information to include, and so they added that on the side. That's one of the reasons it's important to find original documents as you're doing research, because you'll be able to find notes like that sometimes. The other thing to keep in mind is that someone may have died or been born in a county different than where they lived. So for example, This person's death certificate tells us that they were a resident in McLennan County, but that they died in Bell County at the VA hospital. So when you're looking for a death record or a birth record, think about where they might have lived, but if they were a veteran, where was the nearest VA hospital? It may not have been in the same county. So now here's a 1929 death certificate. So still in Texas, but much earlier. And you can see how the form looks a little bit different. There's also a lot of information left blank off this form. So if you look at who the informant was and do a little bit of digging, you'll find out that this informant was actually the physician at a hospital where the deceased had been living. And so the doctor didn't have all of the information about her parents or her original residence. And so that is why so many of the parts of this form were left blank. So here's a 1930 Louisiana death certificate. You can see the form looks very similar to Texas forms of the same time period, like the one we just looked at, except this is a mix of handwritten and typed in information, and it's a little sloppy as you look through it. And a little bit of research also tells you that some of the information that the informant gave is incorrect. So keep in mind, not all of the information on a death certificate is always going to be 100% accurate. Moving even earlier in time, this is a register of deaths that was kept by Falls County. Many counties are going to have similar types of ledgers. So the ledger includes the same type of information that would have been kept on a death certificate, but instead of having each individual have their own form, it's just all kept together in a single book for each individual. Now, here's some marriage license that we can look at. So this is 1840. It's a Republic of Texas marriage record. And this is an excerpt from a large ledger book. Now, these large ledger books that keep marriage records are transcriptions of the original document. So this isn't the marriage license itself. It is a transcription of the marriage license that would have been kept by the county, and the couple would have kept the original document. But it contains information about the day they went to get the license. That's the box on the top. And then the second highlighted portion is the part that would have been recorded the day they got married by the minister. And you can see the minister's name is down at the bottom with the arrow. So that would be a good person to research further, to maybe learn more about the church where they got married, what religion were they, because that can lead you to further documents. Here's a 1948 Arkansas marriage record. So some different types of information that you might not expect to see on a marriage document were recorded, such as birth date and birthplace, as well as occupation. So those are good clues to lead you to learn more about these individuals. Similarly, here's a 1954 Oregon marriage record, and it includes, in addition to occupation and date of birth, place of birth, and mother and father's names. So you get a lot of great information that can help you do more research about this individual. You also see that the marriage date and the date of filing are from 2 different years because they got married at the end of the year. So as you're looking for records, keep in mind that the date that an event happened and the date that something was filed may not be the same day. Divorce records also provide important clues, and these are often found in court record books, mixed in with other types of court documents. This one tells us that Minnie's former name, Minnie Smith, was restored to her after her divorce. So it can provide important clues like maiden name. Sometimes you'll also see notes about the children, if they had children, and other types of information recorded. If you aren't sure if your family had a divorce, try checking newspapers. It was very common in the 1800s for court summons to be published in the newspapers. They were required to run for a certain number of weeks before the divorce could be finalized. And this includes great detail about the reason for the divorce and all of the family's information, like where they were living and they had a daughter, and just great information that genealogists love to find. So here is a birth certificate from 1908 in Texas. 1903 was the first year that Texas birth certificates were required by the state, and so this is a really early record. In these early records, it's fairly common to see that children have not yet been named before their birth certificate is filed. So here, the child's name is left blank, but we get other information about the family, such as the parents' names, their nationality, this child is legitimate. But you can see that this is handwritten and not great penmanship, which can lead to some transcription errors if you're trying to read the name on this document. So you can imagine how difficult this may be to find in an index if you're searching for your ancestor's name, but they aren't even named on this document because we don't know the name of this child. In 1927, this is a Texas birth certificate, and you can see how many more questions were being asked, such as how old were the parents when this child was born, what were their birthplaces, how many other children do they have. Here's a delayed birth certificate. So a delayed birth certificate is a record that was created many years after the child was born. So this is something that would have been created later in life, which means that witnesses were required to sign affidavits to certify that this individual was born on the date and in the place and to the people that they claimed. We'll talk more about delayed birth certificates a little bit later in this presentation. So here's a search tip when you're looking at any type of record in a database like Ancestry or Family Search. When you pull up the image of the original, use the arrows on either side to look at the documents before and after the one that it pulls up. For vital records, typically just the record that pulls up is the one that you're interested in. But every once in a while, when you hit that arrow, it'll take you to an additional document for that person. In this case, it takes you to a corrected birth certificate. So we're looking at Nancy Marie Huffman, and this corrected birth certificate was filed in 1952 for an individual who was born in 1917. And there's many more fields on the corrected birth certificate than were on her original document. So we get lots of additional information about her mother and father. Adoption records are a little more complicated than other vital records. The process varies widely based on the time period, the location, the type of adoption, and just all of the different individual circumstances that were part of that adoption. This is a much bigger subject than we can cover in the time period we have available for this video, but know that those records are out there, and there are resources available to help do this type of research.
One of the things to remember is that geographic areas are different. Texas is different from Louisiana, but also within the state, and within the states, there's some changes too. But in the South, birth registrations, death registrations began around 1899 to about 1919, but each state is different. So vital records are controlled by state law, not federal law. New England states began statewide registrations between 1841 and 1897. So wherever you're living or wherever you're researching, you will need to know basically the laws that apply. Midwest states registrations initiated between 1880 and 1920. So the point is just to know the geographic difference between the local laws of when vital records began. Now, one place to look for these particular dates is what we call the Ancestry's Red Book, also Everton's Handy-Book for Genealogists. Now, the Red Book can be found online through a wiki at .rootsweb.com. As you can see, it lists the county and then when those vital records started for that particular county. So it's a great source to have available on your desktop or in print to look at those differences and changes in the vital records. Now, law versus compliance. So counties were required to start by states vital records at a certain time. With a lot of laws, the date of a record to be compliant is not necessarily the date that the record started. So in Texas, as we've talked about, vital records started in 1903. Counties were not compliant until years later. And so you have to actually do a little research for each county to get a feel when vital records were actually available. And by searching the databases like the Texas birth records, birth certificates, or death certificates, looking for the earliest dates, you can kind of see when counties became compliant, and that's something you just have to kind of learn as you go along. Now, remember access today in today's modern online and digital world. We need to remember that there was a long period of time when access was through print, through books and periodicals. And so if you don't have access online, you might want to look for print access, especially marriages, as we'll talk about later. Online family search, databases like Ancestry, Fold3, and digital library sources may have some vital records. Print, so here is some early Fort Bend County records. Early marriages before 1900. So kind of a general rule of thumb is marriages have been around for a long time, and because of that, they have been abstracted and indexed and transcribed and into print forms long before the digital world came along in 20-some years ago. So always check for print versions of vital records that you're interested in. So how do you find a source online that will give you whatever state you're looking for? So here, if we were interested in Alabama, when did Alabama records start? How do I order those records? We would want to go to Google, put in the state, i.e. Alabama, put in the word health and vital, and hit enter, and you're going to come up within 2 or 3 different entries as a results page. You'll see one that has a .gov for Alabama. That is the one that is associated for Alabama. You would find there how to order, what's available online, what's been indexed, that sort of information. So that is a quick, easy search to find the state you're interested in. Family Search definitely has a great resource in their wiki. I would suggest if you have access to Family Search and or Ancestry, that you load those up on your desktop before you use the wiki, so that when you click on a particular record set within the wiki, it will open up in Ancestry or Family Search, and you can search at that point for your ancestor. Otherwise, you would have to click on it, then log in, and then search again. So Family Search Wiki, it's very nice, and there's the address there to look at different states. There's a gentleman named Joe Bine, who's a professional genealogist, and he has, for many, 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 many years, kept up to date with vital records, and he has a number of sites on the internet, and he updates those on a regular basis. Allows you to look at vital records, marriages, birth records, death records, and gives you a pretty good report on what's available for free, what databases charge, and where to access that information. I use these constantly. Now, you have to remember, just because it's a vital record doesn't mean that every piece of information in the record is primary. So we've talked about primary versus secondary, primary being that happened at the moment that the particular thing happened. So for a birth, the date of birth, for date of death, for death certificates, the date of marriage for a marriage certificate. But what about all this other information that you find? And so let's take a look at some of that information. So location information. What's highlighted there is primary versus secondary. So we see the year of resident and how long this person has lived in this particular residence, i.e. the city, McLennan County and Waco. That was given by somebody after the person died. And so that is subjective to their knowledge of this person. The other types of information is information that was more official. And so it'll be primary information. The personal information here, again, you're looking at the informant where the red arrow is. You need to ask yourself, who was the informant to the person that died? Was it a sibling? Was it a child? Was it a spouse? Was it a cousin or an uncle? Sometimes that is the clue that you're looking for to help you identify even more information. But you have to realize that in a time of when something like a death happens, people are stressed out a little bit, and they may not have the information at their fingertips to give the official recorder of the death certificate or birth certificate. So look at these things that are secondary and primary, and just note that there's not all primary just because it's a vital record. Now, the medical information is put in by a doctor or a certified medical technician or the justice of the peace. And so we consider that to be primary. So what are the oldest vital records? Well, I bet you guessed marriages. Marriages do provide information about the couple, and it's just not all the time that their maiden name or their married name. There might be all kind of family connections that you're not expecting in a marriage record. So why are they the most earliest and most widely kept? Well, because marriage is a legal contract. So by law, there's involved property rights between the two individuals. And so those types of records, those contracts, a marriage contract, had to be kept legally. Also, there is religious significance. So many times they're married within the church. And so there's that stipulation there. Now, the challenge is that there was no uniform format, and the look and feel of a marriage record varies from one state and one time period within a state to another. So as Hannah had said before, before civil records started officially, the church took care of that typically, either with the blessing of the state or the government or not. So church records may predate civil records. And by law, civil records have a definite start date, and the format may be somewhat common, but there are variations, as we saw earlier. Now, marriages, there's all kinds of parts and pieces and documents that are associated with marriages. The intention or ban, this was common for before 1850, an announcement of within the church maybe placed on the church door that a couple was getting married. You've heard people say in ceremonies, for those who basically speak now or forever hold your peace. So if you had something or knowledge of a couple, like maybe the groom was already married somewhere else, you were expected to speak up and say something. Bonds were similar to bans, but the groom basically agreed to be charged money if he was not married legally. So he put up a bond to say that if something went wrong, then he would pay the bond. Consent papers we see as part of the marriage certificate or part of the license. A lot of times for certain age groups, we see consent by the parents of that child. Typically the bride might be younger than you would expect. The marriage record itself, you might have the application or license and the return or register somewhere else with a different date, typically returned by the minister performing the marriage. And then the certificate itself, the document that is kept by the couple, may be posted on the wall or hung on the wall or in the file. So marriage has a lot of different documents to look at. So when are marriage records, where are they kept and recorded? They're typically at the county level, but during the New England era, the colonial period, we saw them at the town level. So New England area, the town overrides or overshadows a lot of the counties. So county level report is typically reported to the state. The federal government stays out of this business of vital records. And so there's no federal level records. Under the U.S. Constitution, the regulation of marriage as a general rule is a matter of state law, not federal. So just to note that, no, there's not a source at the federal level. All kinds of information can be found in marriages, things that you didn't expect. As Hannah has showed some of the samples. Marriage status, whether they were widowed, divorced, parents' names, location where they lived. That's a great clue right there. The maiden name of the spouse, the wife, is typically something we look for in marriages. Birth records, they typically begin around the same time as death records. We see all kinds of things in birth records, including the name of the child, the parents, their sex, number of other children born to the mother. And so a lot of times this is where you find out there were other children that may not have made it to adulthood, occupation of the parents, whether they were legitimate or not, who delivered the baby, where they lived. So birth records are full of clues that help us in our research. Now, state laws start a certain time, but sometimes we don't know all the information that we should know. So it's vital is no pun intended, but it's vital that we learn the history of the areas in which our ancestors lived in order to do the best research, to do a complete comprehensive search. And so in Texas in 1873 and earlier, to 1838 to 1878, there were laws after the Civil War. During the time of Reconstruction, there were laws enacted that said states, counties should start collecting vital records, birth records. And then that was rescinded, but there are a number of years there. And so if you didn't know that, you would not know that in 1873, 74, and 75, there are birth records for McLennan County at the county archive. And so this is the kind of information that you want to look for. Know a little bit of history of the state you're involved looking at, and also the county level and where there might be other records.
As you're researching your ancestors, you may come across conflicting information. This is where you have multiple sources that are giving you different answers to the same question. So for example, if you're researching Effie Baker Dickey, you may notice that on her headstone, her birth date is recorded as June 6, 1892, but on the 1900 census, her birth is recorded as June of 1887. So which is it? Was she born in June of 1887 or June of 1892? Well, it's important to remember that neither of these documents are primary sources for birth information. But Texas birth certificates didn't start until 1903. So how do you know what date to use? Well, you keep looking for other documents, and you may find a Social Security Death Index. We'll talk more about this type of document, the Social Security Death Index, in part 5 of this series. But this document gave us a third date to look at, which is June of 1890. Something important to know is if you do see someone who's listed on a Social Security record, that is a good clue that they may have had a delayed birth certificate, because a birth certificate was required in order to apply for Social Security. So to find a delayed birth certificate in Texas, there is a record set on Family Search called Texas Births and Christenings 1840 to 1981. Not every Texas county is included in this record set, but it's a good place to start. If you aren't familiar with Family Search, we talk more about how to create a Family Search account in part 2 of this series. So once you search for a name, you'll find the index record. When you click on the record that matches, it'll take you to a transcription of the document, but this is just a partial transcription. And you'll notice that the image may not be attached. But there's this notice that this record came from a set of images, and you can find the record by browsing the film. You'll also see under document information the number of the film that is available. Jot that number down and keep it in your source notes for this information. And then click Browse the Film. It's important to know that all microfilm is arranged a little bit differently, and so you'll have to click through a few images on the microfilm to get an understanding of the organization on that roll. And keep in mind, there may be multiple types of records on a single roll of film. So when you pull it up, it may not take you straight to the birth records. You may have to scroll through several sections of the film before you get to the part that contains the birth records. Once you find the record you're looking for, you have so much more information than we saw in that original transcription. And here we have a date of birth. We also have the affidavits that were signed by witnesses to the birth. And so those witnesses are great leads for fan research, which includes researching family, associates, and neighbors. That leads you to great additional details about your ancestors by learning about the people who were involved in their life. But for now, we're concerned about solving the mystery of her birth date. So now we have 4 different days: the census, which gave us June of 87, the headstone, which gave us June 6th of 92, the Social Security Death Index, which gave us June 5th of 90, and the delayed birth certificate, which gave us June 6th of 1890. So we have 4 different days to look at, but what was the only record that was completed by Effie and signed by witnesses during her lifetime? That would be the delayed birth certificate. When a vital record is unavailable, where can you search? There's lots of other records out there, such as funeral home, church records, census, newspapers, military, just to name a few. But we'll get into more of these later in the next video of the series, part 5. So for now, remember your search strategy. Know when records became available in a given location and when they become public record, and then look for exceptions to that rule. Also, evaluate what the information is telling you and whether it is primary or secondary. If you have any questions, we're here to help you, and you can come visit us at the Waco Genealogy Center located at 5301 Bosque Boulevard at the West Waco Library and Genealogy Center, or give us a call at 254-750-5945, or email us at wmclgenealogycenter@wacotx.gov. Thanks for watching.